She did not know he was watching. That was the thing Cecily Vane would turn over later, in the quiet of her room, with the winter pressing against the windowpane and the fire low and uncertain. She had not known. She had acted without an audience, without calculation, without the small performance of virtue that the season seemed to demand of every woman who hoped to be seen as good. She had simply done what her hands knew to do. What the part of her that had not yet been rubbed smooth by 18 months of reduced circumstances still knew to be correct, and she had not noticed the man standing 15 feet behind her in the shadow of the church portico, still as carved stone, watching with an expression that no one at the Allerton Winter Assembly would have recognized as belonging to him at all. The evening had begun, as so many evenings began that December in Wiltshire, with Cecily being placed where she could do the least damage. Lady Prentworth had not phrased it in those words. Lady Prentworth never phrased anything directly when obliqueness would wound more precisely. She had simply suggested, in the way she had perfected over 20 years of managing her late brother's indebted estate, that the Countess of Ashby, now widowed these 4 months, and presently dependent on the family's seasonal charity, might prefer a seat near the cloakroom, where the draughts were milder and the company less likely to remind her of what she had once been. Cecily had thanked her. She was very good at thanking people. She was 27 years old. Her husband, the Earl of Ashby, had died in September, leaving debts that swallowed the estate entire. A title she could no longer claim in any practical sense, and a single piece of jewelry she had managed to keep from the solicitors, because she had worn it on the day they came. The pearl brooch her mother had given her at her own wedding, small and slightly yellowed, and worth very little by any market standard. She wore it now, pinned at the throat of her gray gown, which was the better of 2 gray gowns, and still showed its age at the cuffs. Cecily Vane, who had once been Cecily Hartwell of the Dorset Hartwells, and then Lady Ashby of 3 counties, was now, in the vocabulary the season had settled on without consulting her, simply the widow with debts. She had heard it twice already that evening, once from a young woman near the punch table who had not lowered her voice, and once, more carefully arranged, from Lady Prentworth herself, who had introduced her to the vicar's wife as my late brother's rather unlucky connection. The one I mentioned. Cecily had smiled at the vicar's wife. She was very good at that too. It was the errand to the cloakroom that changed things. She had gone to retrieve a shawl, because the seat by the cloakroom was in fact cold, regardless of what Lady Prentworth had implied, and she had taken the side door into the narrow passage that led out briefly onto the church steps before bending back toward the assembly rooms. She had not intended to step outside. The cold was complete and immediate, a Wiltshire December in its full sincerity, and the stones of the church steps were pale with frost. A figure sat on the bottom step, a man perhaps 60 years of age, his coat inadequate for the weather, his hat held in his hands in the posture of someone who has learned not to ask directly for anything. Cecily stopped. She did not think about it for very long. She opened the small purse at her wrist, found the 2 shillings that were all that remained of her week's allowance from Lady Prentworth, and held them out. The man looked at her hand and then at her face with the specific expression of someone who had been disappointed recently enough to still be braced against it. She kept her hand steady. He took the coins. Then she unpinned the pearl brooch from her throat. She did not know exactly why. It was not, she would think later, a reasoned decision. It was the cold on his hands, which she could see were not adequately gloved, and the inadequate coat, and the particular December that pressed in from all sides, and the fact that she could no longer protect everything she had once valued, so she might as well let go of one more thing cleanly, with her own hands, rather than watch it be taken. She pressed the brooch into his palm and folded his fingers over it. "It is worth something," she said, "if you take it to Bartfield's on the High Street. Tell them the setting is genuine silver." She did not wait to see his face change. She went back inside. She did not know that behind her, in the shadow of the portico where he had stepped to take the air and clear his head of a conversation he had not wanted, Charles Alderton, the Duke of Wrentham, had seen every word of it. What she knew of the Duke of Wrentham was what everyone in 3 counties knew, that he was 41 years old and had been cold for approximately 10 of those years, since the death of his wife in childbirth and the death of the child with her, which had produced in him a stillness so complete that younger men sometimes forgot. He was capable of ordinary feeling, and older men respected the stillness as hard-earned. That he was the largest landowner in Wiltshire and the second largest in Dorset. That he held his opinions behind his face with the discipline of someone who had learned that every expression was copied and reported, that he attended assemblies out of a duty to his position, which he discharged without visible enthusiasm, and that he had declined, over the course of 2 seasons, 3 engagements of the eligible widow variety, arranged by a dowager aunt, who had decided his grief was scheduled. She did not know that he had watched her unpin the pearl brooch. She did not know what his face had done. She settled back into her seat near the cloakroom and was cold, and the assembly went on around her, and nobody particularly noticed that she had returned without the brooch at her throat, except Lady Prentworth, who noticed everything. "What became of your ornament?" Lady Prentworth asked during the supper interval, her tone carrying that particular quality of concern that was primarily inventory. "I mislaid it," Cecily said. "I am sorry." Lady Prentworth's gaze moved over her in the way it did when she was calculating. "You should take better care. You have very little left to mislay." Cecily agreed that this was true. She did not see the Duke of Wrentham again that evening, or if she did not know she was seeing him. The assembly rooms were full of gentlemen of rank, and she had not been introduced to many of them, and had learned, in 18 months of reduced circumstances, that introductions were not always offered to women in her position. She ate the supper that was placed before her. She thanked the footman. She listened to Lady Prentworth explain her late brother's debts to a sympathetic neighbor in terms that made Cecily's continued presence in the household sound like a form of Christian generosity, rather than the complicated negotiation it actually was. She went home in the carriage and sat in the cold of her small room and looked at the place on her gown, where the brooch had been, and felt, not grief exactly, but a kind of quiet finality, as if she had set down the last of something she had carried a very long way. She was still looking at that empty place when the fire went out. She did not know what she missed. 2 days later, when the note arrived for Lady Prentworth, she did not see its contents. She knew only that Lady Prentworth summoned her to the drawing-room with an expression that had temporarily lost its practiced arrangement, and informed her that the Duke of Wrentham was requesting the honor of calling the following afternoon, and that the request was addressed, improbably, to Cecily. Lady Prentworth said improbably in the way she said a great many things, quietly and with feeling. Cecily did not know what to make of it. She said she would receive him, and Lady Prentworth said she supposed so, and the following afternoon arrived with the slow weight of winter afternoons, grey and deliberate, and the Duke of Wrentham was shown into the drawing-room at precisely 3 o'clock, and was not in person what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for coldness. What she found instead was a man who stood very still in the doorway for a moment, in which he appeared to be resolving something internal, and then crossed the room with a directness that suggested he had already decided what he was going to do before he arrived. He was tall. His face was not unkind, only guarded in the way that faces are guarded when they have learned that expression is currency. "Lady Ashby," he said, which was not the title she currently held or had any right to, and she was about to correct it when he continued, "You will not correct me. I am using it deliberately." She waited. "You gave a man something of value on the steps of St. Bridget's 2 nights ago," he said. "I was present. I should like to know why." Something in her steadied. She had expected, without having named the expectation, a complaint, an inquiry, something proprietary about the conduct of a woman in a difficult position. She found, instead, a question delivered with a scrupulous absence of judgment, as if he genuinely did not know the answer and had not arranged one in advance. "It was cold," she said, "and I had it." And he did not. He looked at her for a long moment. His face did the thing she would come to recognize later, the thing that looked like calculation, but was in fact closer to comprehension arriving. "The brooch was not costume," he said. "It was personal." She did not answer. He had not asked a question. "I should like to make it up to you," he said. "You will think this inappropriate, and you may say so, and I will leave. I am not attempting to compensate you for a moral act. I am attempting to find a reason to speak with you again that does not require me to manufacture one." It was, she thought, the most direct thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. She is not a woman to lose carelessly, she would hear him say later, in a different room, in a different moment, and she would understand then what he had seen on the steps of St. Bridget's. She did not understand it yet. She only understood that he was still in the room, and that for the first time in 18 months she was not looking for a graceful way to make herself smaller. He called again on Thursday. Lady Prentworth received him in the drawing room with an expression that had been carefully reassembled and was performing neutrality with great concentration. She offered tea. She placed herself at the far end of the sofa with the specific posture of a chaperone who is also conducting a survey. He addressed himself to Cecily. He did not do it with the elaborate tact of a man managing a difficult conversation. He asked her what she had read in the past month, and she told him, and he disagreed with her assessment of one of the volumes, and she disagreed with his disagreement. And Lady Prentworth's teacup paused halfway to its saucer and did not resume its journey for some time. He asked about the Dorset Hartwells, not in the genealogical way that sometimes preceded the more pointed question about the marriage settlement, but in the way of someone who had looked into the family's history and found it interesting on its own terms. He did not mention her husband. He did not mention her circumstances. He drank his tea and left at the prescribed hour and said, at the door, that he had brought something. He gave the footman a small package wrapped in brown paper. The footman brought it to Cecily after the carriage had gone. Lady Prentworth watched from the doorway of the drawing room. Inside the package was a pearl brooch. Not her brooch, which was gone, but one of a similar age, slightly smaller, the setting in genuine silver as promised. Tucked beneath it was a card that said only, "For the cold," Lady Prentworth said from the doorway. "He is persistent." Cecily held the brooch and thought about the man on the church steps folding his fingers over something she could not keep, and the peculiar relief of it, and the brooch in her hand now which she had not earned or expected, and she did not know what to do with any of it, except to pin it at her throat where the other one had been, and find that it sat there as if it had always meant to. She did not know that her response was being managed for her. She would not know this for 3 more weeks. Lady Prentworth wrote to her sister in Bath at the end of that same week. Cecily did not see the letter. She knew only that it was sent, because she carried it to the post herself at Lady Prentworth's request, and that the handwriting on the direction had the swift confidence of someone who believed the matter was settled. Lady Prentworth's sister in Bath was Lady Greville, who had a daughter of 22 and had spent the past season hoping the Duke of Wrentham would find that daughter visible in the right rooms at the right moments. That hope, Cecily gathered gradually from the shape of things she was not told directly, had not yet expired. The sister arrived in Wiltshire in the 2nd week of January. She brought her daughter, Miss Honoria Greville, who was fair and beautifully dressed, and looked at Cecily once with the rapid assessment of a woman who has been told precisely who she is meant to be assessing. The poor relation, Miss Greville said that first evening to her mother, in a voice calibrated to travel precisely as far as the settee where Cecily was sitting. "I had imagined something rather more." Cecily turned a page of her book. The page was not interesting. She turned it anyway. Miss Greville was accomplished in the ways the season rewarded. She played the pianoforte with the clean precision of real training. She moved through rooms with the ease of someone who had never had to wonder whether she belonged in them. She was, by every visible standard, the correct choice for a Duke of 41 who needed an heir and a household arranged, and she conducted herself in the Duke's presence with a warmth that was so professionally calibrated, it was almost admirable. He was not unkind to her. He was something worse. He was the same in her presence as he was in every other, measured and courteous and unreachable, a man doing his civic duty to a social occasion without allowing the occasion to cost him anything. He came again on the Wednesday. Lady Prentworth had arranged a small evening party, 6 guests including the Grevilles and the vicar and his wife, and Cecily had been placed at the far end of the table, in the arrangement that had become customary, and the Duke of Wrentham arrived and allowed Lady Prentworth to seat him near Miss Greville, and was positioned there for approximately 4 minutes. Before he said, in the quiet declarative way he said most things, that he would prefer the chair beside Miss Hartwell. The table was briefly silent. He had used her name incorrectly in the opposite direction. Not Lady Ashby, which was the elevation she no longer held, but Miss Hartwell, which was the name she had carried before the marriage. The name that had technically been restored by the widowhood, but that no one in Lady Prentworth's household used. He had called her Miss Hartwell. Lady Prentworth said lightly that perhaps the seating had been arranged for the convenience of the party, and that Miss Hartwell was very comfortable where she was. "I am not," Cecily said, surprising herself. The draft from the window is quite persistent. She did not look at Lady Prentworth. She looked at the Duke of Wrentham, who had the expression of a man who has been expecting exactly this and is prepared to wait out any further objection. The chair was moved. He sat beside her. Miss Greville, across the table, continued to be beautiful and well-behaved and looked at Cecily with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite recognition and lived somewhere in the territory between them. They spoke little at dinner. He asked her once about the window she had mentioned, and she said the draft was less than she had claimed, and he said he suspected as much. And something that might have been amusement crossed his face and was gone before she could be certain of it. He passed her the bread roll she had not asked for, and she took it, and they did not look at each other again for the length of the fish course, which was long. She would tell this, or some portion of this, to no one. She did not know how to describe the particular quality of his attention, which was not flattering in any conventional sense and was not warm in any obvious way, but which made her feel that she occupied a precise and specific place in the room, rather than the vague peripheral position she had occupied in every room for 18 months. He noticed when her glass was empty. He did not make a ceremony of noticing. The footman simply appeared. She did not know what any of it meant, or whether it meant anything. Women in her position could not afford to read significance into the civility of men of rank. She had learned this. 3 days later, she overheard the conversation she had not been intended to hear. The drawing room at Prentworth House had a peculiarity in its architecture, a bend in the passage beside it that carried sound from the interior to a point near the back stairs where the acoustics concentrated it. Cecily had learned this in her first month by accident, and had subsequently learned to make her approach to the drawing room via the front corridor, to avoid repeating the experience. On the afternoon in question, she forgot or did not think, or was distracted by the cold coming off the back stairs, and was halfway down the passage before she registered that Lady Prentworth and Lady Greville were speaking on the other side of the wall, and that they were speaking about her. "She has nothing," Lady Greville said. "She has not even the title now, not properly. She is a connection by charity." "He persists," Lady Prentworth said. "Then we manage it. She is not a woman to build a future on. She is not a woman to build anything on. She has debts and a gray gown and no family in any position to support her." A pause. "We simply need him to see it clearly." She stood in the passage and was very still, the way she had learned to be still, when something landed that she had not quite prepared for. The cold from the back stairs moved around her ankles. She had debts and a gray gown. She had known this. It was not new information. The articulation of it in someone else's voice, in the brisk arithmetic of a conversation she was not supposed to hear, produced in her body not grief, but a kind of specific clarity, the way very cold water is clarifying, and she turned and went up the back stairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about it for a long time. She was still thinking when Lady Prentworth knocked. "The Duke of Wrentham has called," Lady Prentworth said from the doorway. Her voice had the quality it sometimes had in moments of social management. "I have told Jennings to say you are unwell." Cecily looked at her. "It is for the best," Lady Prentworth said. "You must see that." "I do not," Cecily said. A beat of silence. Lady Prentworth had not expected that. "You are not in a position," Lady Prentworth began. "No," Cecily agreed, "I am not. You have been generous and I have been grateful, and I know precisely what I am." She stood. "You will please tell Jennings that I am recovered and will come down." Lady Prentworth's expression assembled and disassembled and assembled again in the space of 4 seconds. She left the doorway. Cecily pinned the silver brooch at her throat and went downstairs. He was standing in the hall, not the drawing room, and Jennings was hovering with the air of a man who had received contradictory instructions and was attempting to honor both. The Duke had not removed his coat. He had not, she thought, expected to be invited to. He looked at her when she came down the stairs, and then at the brooch at her throat, with an expression that confirmed he recognized it, and was satisfied by this in some way he did not intend to. "Explain." "You are recovered," he said. "I was not ill," she said. "No," he said. "I did not think you were." Lady Prentworth appeared in the drawing-room doorway. He turned to her and said, with the courtesy that held no warmth but also no cruelty, that he hoped she would forgive the presumption, and asked whether Miss Hartwell might walk with him in the grounds for a quarter of an hour, as it was not raining, and he had a matter he wished to discuss that did not require an audience. Lady Prentworth said that it was quite cold. He agreed that it was. He waited. Lady Prentworth said she supposed a quarter of an hour was permissible. They walked the south path, the one that ran alongside the kitchen garden wall, where the frost had not fully lifted despite the pale sun. He walked beside her and was quiet for a time, which she had come to recognize as the way he organized his thoughts before speaking them, not as dismissal but as preparation. My wife died 8 years ago, he said. Clara, she died in October, the child with her. She did not speak. I have not spoken of it in company in 6 years, he said. I find I want to tell you. I am not certain why, except that you do not require people to be other than they are, and that is rarer than it should be. The path was narrow, and the kitchen garden wall was close, and the frost was white along the top of it. She thought about the man on the church steps, and the brooch, and the clean relief of letting go of something with her own hands. And she thought this was a different kind of letting go. And she was watching it happen, and did not know what to do with the privilege of watching it. I carried a miniature of her for 4 years, he said. I do not carry it anymore. I keep it in the cabinet in my study in Wrentham. I cannot look at it, and I cannot discard it, and I have made my peace with that being true. He paused. I tell you this because I am not a man who forms attachments carelessly. I want you to know that when I say I have noticed you precisely. Not the widow with debts, you. She should have named it right here, should have turned and looked at him, and let her face answer him honestly. She did not. She had 18 months of discipline working against her, and she was not yet certain. She could trust what she was feeling, not to be the wishful reading of a woman who had been cold for a very long time. You should consider Miss Greville, she said. She is everything suited to your position. He was quiet again. She looked at the frost on the wall. I did not ask your counsel on the matter, he said, not unkindly. I asked for a quarter of an hour of your company. She gave it to him. They turned at the end of the path and walked back, and he said nothing more of Clara or of the miniature in the cabinet. And she said nothing of what had settled in her chest at the mention of a name. Held for 8 years, he left at the gate. She went inside. Lady Prentworth was waiting in the hall with an expression she had not bothered to compose. He is playing a game, Lady Prentworth said. Men of his position do. You should not mistake attention for intention. Cecily went upstairs and did not answer. She took the silver brooch from her throat and held it in her hand, and thought about a miniature in a cabinet and a man who said he had noticed her precisely, and the cold of the kitchen garden path, and the frost, and the pale winter sun on the wall. She did not know the invitation had already been sent. Lady Prentworth delivered it to her the following morning, with a face that indicated she had decided on a strategy and was implementing it. The Duke of Wrentham was hosting a small dinner at Wrentham Park in 10 days, and had included Lady Prentworth's household in the invitation. The household, Lady Prentworth explained, would attend, all of it. Cecily included, since declining would attract its own commentary. The Greville party would also attend. I mention it, Lady Prentworth said, so that you might prepare yourself. Cecily thanked her and went to find something suitable to wear that did not broadcast quite so loudly the condition of her circumstances, which was the kind of problem that had no real solution, and taught her mostly about the exhausting arithmetic of dignity on a limited budget. Miss Greville arrived at Wrentham Park on the evening of the dinner in a gown of pale gold that was everything the occasion demanded, and took in the house with the calm assessment of a woman who has been told it might become hers and is verifying the report. She was pleasant to Cecily in the manner of someone who has decided pleasantness is the correct tactical register and is committed to it. She was seated at the Duke's right hand at dinner. Cecily was placed midway down the table beside the vicar's wife, Mrs. Calloway, who was warm and direct and spoke without calculation, which was a relief Cecily had not anticipated. He is nothing like what they say, Mrs. Calloway said quietly, during the fish course, with a nod toward the head of the table. They say cold. They mean contained. It is not the same thing at all, Cecily said she supposed not. He speaks of his ward, Mrs. Calloway said, a boy of 11. Did you know? He has had care of him since his brother died. The boy is at school, but he writes to him every fortnight. She paused. A cold man does not write to a child every fortnight. Cecily looked down the length of the table. He was speaking to Miss Greville, who was saying something that produced in him the polite attention that was his public face, unchanged and steady and entirely unlike the expression she had seen on the kitchen garden path. She did not examine the relief she felt at the difference. After dinner, the party gathered in the music room. Miss Greville played the pianoforte and played it superbly, and the room listened with the appreciation that real skill deserves, and the Duke listened from his position near the fireplace, with the same courteous attention he brought to everything, which told no one in the room what he thought. Cecily sat near the window. Outside, the grounds of Wrentham Park were dark and frost-covered, and the window glass was cold against the air. She did not realize she was pressing close to it until his voice came from beside her. "You are not musical," he said. She turned. He had crossed from the fireplace without her hearing him. "I am sufficiently musical," she said. "I simply do not perform it. There is a distinction. There are many." He stood beside her and was quiet for a moment, and across the room Miss Greville finished the piece, and the room applauded, and Lady Prentworth looked toward the window and found the Duke standing beside Cecily, and her expression did something brief and controlled. "She plays very well," Cecily said. "She does," he agreed. "She would manage your household with efficiency." "I have a housekeeper for that," he said. "What I do not have is someone who unpins a pearl brooch from her own throat on a cold evening and gives it to a stranger without looking back to see if the gesture was noticed." He did not move from the window. "That I have found only once." Miss Greville began a second piece. Lady Prentworth was still watching from across the room, and Lady Greville had joined her, and both of them were looking at the window with the concentrated focus of women who have decided something is happening that should not be allowed to continue. Cecily did not know that the conversation they were about to have 3 days later in Lady Prentworth's drawing room would be the one that finally cracked the 18 months of careful self-containment. It was not a private conversation. That was the particular cruelty of it. Lady Prentworth had arranged a small morning call, herself and Lady Greville, and 2 other neighbors whose names Cecily knew without knowing them well, and Cecily had been present because absenting herself would have required a reason. And the reason would have been the truth, and the truth was not available to her. She had sat near the window, the same peripheral position she had occupied for 18 months, and she had listened. "She is not without feeling," Lady Prentworth said. At the point in the morning when the conversation had traveled as she had always intended it to travel, only without prospects, I do feel for her. A widow with debts and nothing to recommend her position has very few choices. One must simply hope she understands what she is. What she is, Lady Greville said, with the particular pleasure of a woman delivering a judgment she has rehearsed, is a woman the season has already moved past. It is not her fault. It is simply the nature of things. Cecily's teacup was in her hand. She set it down. She had set things down carefully for 18 months. She had set down her title and her household, and her husband's name and her mother's brooch, and the idea that she was owed anything at all from a world that had decided what she was before she had a chance to correct it. She had set all of it down with the controlled grace she had taught herself, because the alternative was to become someone the season could dismiss even more easily than it was already doing. She stood. "I wonder," she said, into the morning room which had gone very still, "whether you are speaking about me because you believe I cannot hear you, or because you have decided it does not matter that I can." No one answered. Lady Prentworth's teacup paused. "I have been grateful," Cecily said, "genuinely, and I have understood all along what I am here and what value I carry in your calculation. A woman with debts and a gray gown, the widow with nothing to recommend her." She looked at Lady Prentworth. "You have not been cruel. You have been what the season makes of generous people. I find I am no longer willing to sit at the window and listen to myself described." She excused herself. She went upstairs. She sat on the bed, and her hands were not entirely steady, and the silver brooch was cold against her throat, and she did not know what she had just done or what it would cost. Only that she could not have done otherwise, and that for the second time in a month she had let something go that she could not keep, and that this time the loss was not clean. It was 2 hours later when Jennings came to the door. "His Grace, the Duke of Wrentham," Jennings said, with a formality that suggested he had been coached, "is in the hall. He says he will not leave." She went downstairs. Lady Prentworth was in the drawing-room doorway again, and Lady Greville beside her, and the 2 neighbors whose names she never quite remembered had not yet gone home. And the hall was full of witnesses, which she did not think had been arranged by accident. He was standing at the center of the hall. He had not removed his coat. He looked at her when she came down the stairs, with the expression she had not been able to name in the drawing room of Wrentham Park, the one that was not calculation and not warmth exactly, but something older and more settled than either, the expression of a man who has made a decision and is prepared to stand in it regardless of what the room does next. "I owe you something," he said, loudly enough to be heard. She waited. "An apology," he said, "for the world you have been asked to inhabit these past months. I cannot address that directly. I can address it in the only way available to me." He paused. "I am asking Miss Hartwell to do me the honor of becoming my wife." The hall was quiet. Lady Prentworth made a sound that was not quite a word. Miss Greville, who had appeared from the direction of the morning room, said nothing. Her face was composed. She looked at Cecily with an expression that passed through several registers in the space of a breath and arrived, finally, at something that was not quite concession and not quite respect, and lived in the territory between them. Lady Greville said, in a voice that was attempting to find its social footing and had not yet located it, "This is highly irregular." "It is," he agreed. He did not look at Lady Greville. He was looking at Cecily. Cecily looked back at him. She thought about the kitchen garden path and the frost on the wall, and a miniature in a cabinet and a child at school who received letters every fortnight. She thought about standing at the window in the music room while Miss Greville played perfectly, and feeling the cold of the glass against the air in a way that was also about 18 months of being placed near drafts and told to be grateful for the position. She thought about a man on church steps folding his fingers over something she could not keep. "Yes," she said. He crossed the hall to her in 3 strides and took her hand and held it in the way he had of doing everything, with a precision that was not cold at all, but was in fact the opposite, the warmth of a man who does not distribute his attention carelessly and has brought all of it here, to this hall, to this moment, to her specifically. "Miss Hartwell," he said quietly, only for her, "will you come inside?" She understood now what the commands had always been. Lady Prentworth said something that required recovery. Lady Greville said something that required more. Neither of them said anything that was heard above the sound of the hall rearranging itself around. The fact that the verdict had been reversed in front of the same witnesses who had delivered it, and that the reversal was irrevocable. The neighbors whose names she had never quite remembered would tell the story for years, she learned later, and they always told the part where she had not looked triumphant. They always mentioned that. She had simply looked like a woman who had put something down a long time ago and had only just understood that someone had been carrying it for her. It was Mrs. Calloway, the vicar's wife, who found her in the morning room a short while later, while the hall was still sorting itself out. She looked at Cecily for a moment with the direct warmth that was her particular quality and took both her hands. "I told you," Mrs. Calloway said. "Contained, not cold." Cecily laughed, which surprised both of them, and it was not a polished sound. Nothing like the smile she had practiced for 18 months, but it was real, and it was hers. The miniature of Clara was still in the cabinet at Wrentham Park when they came home to it in late February, and Cecily did not move it. She asked him about it once, in the way they had both learned to ask each other things, directly and without ceremony, and he said he had thought many times about where to put it, and had decided it belonged in the room where he worked, because Clara had been someone he worked very hard to be worthy of. And that grief was not a debt to be paid, but a thing that changed its shape over time without becoming smaller. She thought about 18 months of gray gowns and peripheral seats and a pearl brooch on the steps of St. Bridget's, and understood that she was standing in a life that had been shaped by loss before she arrived in it, and that she did not want to change that, only to add to it. On the first night of spring, she found the silver brooch in her jewel box and pinned it at her throat for dinner. And he noticed it the way he noticed everything she did, precisely and without comment. And later, when the fire was low and the grounds of Wrentham were dark and fragrant with the particular smell of earth beginning to warm again, he took her hand across the table in the small, quiet way he had of being tender, which was not the grand and declarative kind, but was the kind that had always been there in the commands that were protection, and the glass refilled, without ceremony, and the chair moved in a cold house to a warmer position, because she should not be cold. She had been cold long enough. The pearl brooch sat at her throat in the firelight. If you have stayed here until the end, you know what it means. You knew before she did. The grounds of Wrentham were still and white with the last of the winter, and the house held its warmth against the dark, and inside it she was finally, irrevocably home.